The village of Elderwood had always prided itself on its quiet beauty, an undisturbed corner of the English countryside, where gossip bloomed like wild roses and every front gate squeaked with familiar charm. Nestled between gently rolling hills and ancient oak groves, the village wore the month of June like a well-fitted summer dress, bright, tasteful, and just a little flirtatious. On this particular afternoon, a rare kind of perfection reigned. The air was warm, not hot. A soft breeze teased the lace curtains of open cottage windows. Bees worked lazily in their ceaseless way, drifting from hollyhocks to foxgloves, and the elder trees along the winding lanes whispered secrets with every rustling leaf. It was on such a day that the Elderwood Rose Society held its annual garden party, an event of no small importance to the local calendar. It took place, as it always did, on the well-manicured grounds of Elderwood Hall, a Georgian estate with faded grandeur and rhododendrons the size of parish pews. This year's party was expected to be particularly splendid. The roses, coaxed by an especially gentle spring, were in glorious bloom, and the event promised a proper display of village pride, rivalry, and carefully hidden insecurities. Just the sort of thing that made Miss Jane Marple quietly take notice. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes before the appointed time of 3 o'clock. She had taken the scenic route through the meadows, politely refusing a ride from Mr. Pettinger, the grocer, who had a somewhat aggressive way with his Austen and a penchant for making up road stories. She preferred to observe the comings and goings of her fellow villagers at a slower pace, a magpie's nest. A muddy boot print at the edge of the field? The way Daphne Longhurst's bicycle was leaned, not against her own garden wall, but against the gate of the vicarage. These small, seemingly insignificant things were the pages of a book only Miss Marple seemed to know how to read. She approached Elderwood Hall with the unassuming air that had long served her well. Dressed in a dove-gray summer coat with a floral scarf tucked modestly at the throat, her straw hat bore a small cluster of pressed violets, modest, deliberate, and telling. "Miss Marple, what a delight!" boomed Colonel Arbuthnot, the garden party ceremonial host, as he spotted her near the croquet lawn. "We were just saying the roses wouldn't dare bloom without you." Now, Miss Marple smiled gently. "Roses bloom for bees, not spinsters. But I dare say they look particularly fine this year." "They do," the colonel agreed, mopping his brow with a linen handkerchief. "All down to Murgatroyd's new composting mixture. Smells like perdition, but by Jove, it works." Mrs. Arbuthnot, tall and ramrod straight, emerged from the shade of the wisteria arch like an exclamation point in lilac silk. "Jane, my dear," she said, with an embrace that was all elbows and lavender perfume, "have you seen the Duchess? The Rose, I mean, not Lady Hawthorne, though she's here too, regrettably. I've had it pruned to perfection. I shall make a point of admiring it," said Miss Marple, eyes crinkling. "Though I expect Lady Hawthorne won't take kindly to any competition for her. Imperial satin." Mrs. Arbuthnot gave a thin-lipped smile. "Let her take it as she will. Not everyone understands restraint in rose cultivation." The party was well underway. Tables set beneath cream-colored marquees held platters of dainty sandwiches, iced fairy cakes, strawberry tarts, and cut-glass bowls of gooseberry fool. The village string quartet played light selections from Elgar and Haydn under a pergola, and the air was filled with the mingled scent of rose petals, fresh grass, and faint rivalry. The guests were all there. Dr. Jonathan Percival, fresh from his London posting and still a bachelor, with his neatly parted hair and clear, direct gaze. Ellen Fitzwilliam, the shy daughter of the late schoolmaster, trying to appear composed in a dress a little too fine for her income. Daphne Longhurst, daughter of the magistrate, vivacious and not above flirting with Dr. Percival while pretending to admire the wisteria. Reverend Latterly and his pink-faced wife, both devoted to cake and character judgment. Lady Hawthorne, regal and aloof, surveying her surroundings as if she'd been born to rule over roses and lesser mortals alike. Miss Marple walked slowly through the garden, nodding here, commenting there. She observed the subtle dramas unfolding among the vines and shrubs. Mrs. Craddock's cool glance toward Mrs. Broomley, who had won the jam competition last autumn. The nervous flick of Ellen's fingers as she passed Dr. Percival. The sudden tension in Daphne's smile when she spotted someone approaching. That someone was Martin Trent, tall, well-dressed, with a touch of rakish charm and the sort of self-assurance that made men wary and women curious. Trent had arrived in Elderwood only 3 months earlier. He claimed to be a writer, though no one had seen him write anything except checks. And those, Miss Marple suspected, were not always backed by funds. He had been invited by the Arbuthnot's with some reluctance, mostly at the insistence of Colonel Arbuthnot, who had taken a liking to his stories of Cairo and Constantinople. There was something magnetic about him, something that had drawn him into the heart of village life far more swiftly than most newcomers ever managed, and now he was dead. The scream came just after the 4th song from the quartet, and it silenced the garden more quickly than any conductor's baton. Guests froze, cutlery clattered, the air turned sharply still. It was Ellen Fitzwilliam who had screamed, her pale face a ghostly contrast to her rose-pink dress. She stood near the edge of the arboretum path, hands raised to her mouth, eyes wild. In the arboretum, she choked out. "There's someone. He's not moving. I think he's dead." People began to move in a swirl of confusion. Dr. Percival rushed forward, barking for his bag. Colonel Arbuthnot stormed in the opposite direction, shouting orders to no one in particular. Mrs. Arbuthnot clutched her pearls and directed a servant to bring smelling salts. Several guests tried to comfort Ellen, who was now sobbing into her handkerchief. Miss Marple said nothing. She quietly turned and made her way through the shaded path toward the arboretum, her pace steady, her gaze unblinking. Beneath the boughs of a heavy yew tree, near the back wall where the sun barely touched, lay the still form of Martin Trent. His jacket was unbuttoned, his shirt slightly torn at the collar. His eyes, glassy and wide, stared at nothing. The back of his head rested in a pool of dark blood among the moss and roots. Dr. Percival knelt beside him, jaw clenched. "Blunt force trauma," he murmured after a moment. "Massive head wound, no pulse, he's dead." Someone gasped behind them. A faint sob, the sharp clip of Lady Hawthorne's heels on gravel. Miss Marple knelt as well, not to examine the body, though she did, but to take in the scene as a whole. A small bramble along the path bore a shred of rose-pink silk. A crushed cigarette buttonlet lay beside a fallen glove. A faint scent of cologne, not Mr. Trent's usual choice, lingered in the air. Above all, it was the expressions of those who followed into the scene that Miss Marple watched with greatest care: fear, horror, guilt, calculation. Each face told a different story. Most would be false. For in Elderwood, as in all places where gentility masks secrets, murder never arrives without a backstory. And Miss Marple, already storing away every glance, gesture, and murmured word, knew the story had only just begun. By the time the local constable, Sergeant Cornish, arrived at Elderwood Hall a full 20 minutes after the discovery of Martin Trent's body, the garden party had splintered into a dozen chattering clusters. Plates of uneaten cake sagged in the heat. The string quartet had long since abandoned their instruments, standing awkwardly near the refreshment table, unsure whether to pack up or wait for instruction. "Never had a murder at a rose party," muttered old Mr. Willoughby, the retired solicitor, to no one in particular. "Though there was that business with the goat in 47, nasty scratch, that was." But murder, well, Sergeant Cornish, a solid man with a red face and very little tolerance for the finer points of social diplomacy, stood with a pencil and notepad, attempting to bring order to chaos. "No one is to leave the grounds," he declared. "Not until I've had a word with each of you. And I'll be asking that no one tampers with the scene. Dr. Percival, you saw to the victim." Dr. Percival, who had been standing quietly with his arms folded, gave a grim nod. "Blunt object, back of the skull. Death was likely immediate. Any signs of a struggle? None obvious. Shirt was slightly torn, possibly grabbed in alarm, no bruising. No defensive wounds. His pocket watch was still on him, as were his cufflinks and wallet. So not robbery, then." Cornish grunted, scratching something on his pad. "Well, someone had reason to want him dead. And likely it was someone here. This pronouncement sent a visible ripple through the nearest group of guests. Mrs. Latterly, always one to speak where silence might be wiser, clutched her husband's arm. "You don't suppose it was someone from outside the village?" "She?" asked the sergeant, her voice just loud enough to reach several ears. Cornish glanced up. "Doesn't appear so?" No footprints but those already on the gravel. Whoever did it came from the party or never left. It was enough to turn the garden into a bubbling cauldron of whispered theories. By 5:30, Miss Marple had resumed her seat beneath the wisteria-covered pergola, a modest cup of cold tea beside her. She did not seem particularly upset, merely thoughtful. She sat quite still, her gaze drifting across the scene like a feather in the breeze, noting who huddled with whom, who seemed eager to talk, and who remained suspiciously silent. Across the lawn, Daphne Longhurst was pacing, arms crossed, her once perfect hairstyle beginning to fray. "I just don't understand it," she said for the 5th time, mostly to Ellen Fitzwilliam, who was seated and still visibly shaken. "I saw him not 15 minutes before it happened. He was joking about something, said the roses smelled like cheap perfume." I laughed. "I mean, it was rude, but it was funny. Who would want to do that to him?" Ellen said nothing, staring down at her gloves. She had not removed them since the body was found, though the day remained warm. Nearby, Lady Hawthorne stood beside a marble urn, cool and composed as ever, talking in low tones to her companion, Miss Anstruther, a stiffly formal woman in a peacock blue coat. Though too far for most to hear, Miss Marple, quite used to listening without appearing to, caught snatches. "Never trusted him, not his type," Lady Hawthorne murmured. "And the way he looked at Daphne. No respect," Miss Anstruther added. "He thought himself clever. That kind usually does. Until they get caught in something unsavory." Lady Hawthorne's lips curled slightly. Or worse. Their glances strayed more than once toward Miss Marple, but she only smiled. At the fluttering roses, her hands folded gently in her lap. Elsewhere, Colonel Arbuthnot was arguing with Sergeant Cornish. "You need to be careful what you imply, man," he said gruffly. "These are decent people. This isn't London. People don't just go about murdering each other in broad daylight." "Someone clearly did," Cornish replied, not unkindly. "And I'll need a list of everyone who arrived before 3 o'clock, and any staff who had access to the arboretum or grounds." "Ridiculous," muttered the colonel, but he complied. A group of ladies near the refreshment table were deep in speculation. "I heard he was involved in some kind of scheme," whispered Mrs. Broomley. "You know, financial. Lost money in London? Perhaps someone from there followed him down?" "Or perhaps he wasn't really writing a novel," offered Mrs. Craddock, sipping her sherry with relish. "I mean, we've only his word for it. He was always seen loitering about, watching people, especially Ellen and Daphne, poor girls. It's shameful." Miss Marple stood slowly, her joints not quite as quick as they once were, and made her way toward the arbor entrance where the path curved toward the arboretum. The constable's cordon had been loosely marked with twine and a single volunteer. "Gardener standing guard?" She gave the young man a polite smile. "Terrible business," he murmured, wringing his cap. "I saw him now and then, always asking questions. Took a lot of walks around the back wall there." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the narrow stone bench beneath the yew tree, where the body had lain not an hour before. The blood was still visible, dark against the roots. Just above it, brambles curled in natural tangles, and there again was that shred of rose-pink silk caught on a thorn. She turned back as Mrs. Arbuthnot approached. "Jane, it's horrible," the hostess said, clutching her handbag. "And on our lawn of all places. I told Reginald we should have hired proper help. What will people say?" "People always say something, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly. "The trick is to notice when they say too much and when they say too little." Mrs. Arbuthnot blinked. "What do you mean?" "Only that murder, like mildew, rarely appears overnight. It settles in quietly, taking root where no one expects." Mrs. Arbuthnot gave a flustered laugh and patted her hair. Behind them, more guests were being gently questioned by Sergeant Cornish. The sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the green. The quartet had packed their instruments. Servants brought out lanterns and citronella torches, trying to keep the evening insects at bay. Whispers grew louder as the sky turned amber. Someone said Trent had once been engaged, though no one could recall to whom. Another claimed he'd been seen arguing with a man behind the grocer's last week, and that the constable ought to question young Mr. Murgatroyd. The gardener's son, who had once been seen handing Trent a sealed envelope, Miss Marple heard. It all, filtering facts from embellishment, silence from signal. When she finally returned home to her whitewashed cottage at the edge of the village, twilight was falling. Her housekeeper, Miss Blenkinsop, looked up from her knitting as she entered. "You're back late," she said. "I've kept your supper warm." Miss Marple set her gloves neatly on the hall table and removed her hat. "Thank you, dear, but perhaps just tea tonight." "It's been quite a day." She said nothing more until she was seated in her chair by the window, watching the moonlight filter through her climbing roses. Then, after a long pause, she murmured, "It wasn't a crime of impulse. That sort of blow requires planning and fear or rage." "Or both." Miss Blenkinsop looked up. "You don't think the police will sort it?" "Oh, I'm sure Sergeant Cornish will try," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But the trouble with crime in villages is that everyone knows everyone or thinks they do. And when a stranger disturbs the balance, secrets begin to stir, just like shadows in the garden." Early investigation the morning after the garden. Party dawned pale and uncertain. The sky wore a gauzy veil of cloud, and the village of Elderwood stirred with a peculiar quiet. It was the hush that follows disruption, like the stillness after a dropped teacup, when everyone waits to see who will speak first. At the High Street post office, the queue was longer than usual. Not from necessity, no one had much post on. A Sunday, but because people felt the need to gather. To speak, yes, but more to observe. The butcher, the greengrocer's wife, and Miss Tremaine from the library all exchanged soft murmurs and carefully portioned outrage over tins of boiled sweets and second-class stamps. "Hit on the head, poor soul," Miss Tremaine whispered with relish, sorting through a pile of postcards that had sat unsold since last August. "In the Arboretum, no less. I heard his watch was still ticking when they found him." "Nonsense," said the butcher. "It was stopped at 4:25. My niece overheard Dr. Percival telling the constable." "It's a clue, surely." "Clue to what?" asked the greengrocer's wife. "That someone kept an appointment?" Across the street, Miss Marple, in her neatly pressed morning coat and straw cloche hat, was moving slowly along the lane that led to St. Jude's Church. Her step was steady, her hands folded over her handbag. Though her expression was mild, her thoughts were as active as ever. People often mistook her for idle, simply because she did not bustle. But Miss Marple's mind was not idle. It was patient, methodical, and for those who understood such things, relentless. She had already been up for hours. Her garden had been watered. Her breakfast a soft-boiled egg, toast, and orange marmalade eaten while rereading an old letter from her nephew Raymond. But her real work had begun after that. First, she had reviewed in her mind the entire sequence of yesterday's garden party, who had arrived when, who had spoken to whom, and the subtle expressions that had accompanied each interaction. Then she had examined in quiet mental detail the evidence as it stood, such as it was. Martin Trent had been struck on the back of the head, likely with something heavy but not sharp. No sign of a weapon had yet been found. He had died in a relatively secluded spot, but one still within the bounds of the party. There had been no witness, or at least none who had admitted to being nearby. She paused before the iron gates of the churchyard and turned. Across the green, walking at an uneven pace with the collar of his coat turned up, came Sergeant Cornish. He looked harassed and faintly embarrassed, as if the village were blaming him personally for the murder. "Good morning, Sergeant," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, halting. "Didn't expect to see you about." "Why ever not? One can't miss church simply because of murder." He scratched the back of his neck. "Well, no, I suppose not. Though the vicar's sure to say something. He's not good with tact. I dare say we'll manage." Cornish hesitated. I don't suppose you noticed anything odd yesterday? I've been trying to get statements from the guests, but it's all whispers and contradictions. I did notice one or two things, Miss Marple replied calmly. But only the sort of things one always notices, Sergeant. The way someone reacts when surprised, or when trying not to seem surprised. Cornish gave her a sidelong glance. You've a way of spotting things others don't, Miss Marple. That's known. I wouldn't mind hearing what you think off the record, she smiled, ever so slightly. Oh, but then it wouldn't be quite off the record, would it? Perhaps wait a few days. Truth has a way of surfacing when the shock wears off. With that, she passed into the churchyard, leaving Cornish with the uneasy feeling that she knew more than she was saying, which of course she did at Elderwood. Hall, the Arbuthnot's had refused to cancel their Sunday luncheon. We must carry on, declared Mrs. Arbuthnot, slicing a fruit loaf with brisk efficiency. To wallow in it is exactly what they would expect. Who's they? Asked Colonel Arbuthnot, still in his dressing gown. The sort of people who linger, the Craddocks and Broomleys and that lot, whispering behind their napkins and relishing scandal. No, we'll have luncheon as planned, perhaps trimmed down, but we shall maintain dignity. Guests trickled in Lady Hawthorne, Miss Anstruther, Dr. Percival, and unexpectedly Daphne Longhurst, her eyes puffy from crying but determined to appear unshaken. Ellen Fitzwilliam, notably, was absent. Miss Marple arrived last, as was her custom, slipping into the room with a kind smile and a low remark about the salvia looking especially fine this year. She sat beside Lady Hawthorne and quietly declined the mutton, asking instead for a second helping of potatoes. Conversation over luncheon was strained. The usual topics, weather, roses, the shocking price of preserves, gave way to awkward silences and thin attempts at levity. It was Dr. Percival who broke first. I suppose we must assume the killer is still among us, he said abruptly. The table froze. Mrs. Arbuthnot gave him a scandalized look. Doctor, really? Well, it's the truth, isn't it? He continued, Martin Trent wasn't the sort to offend lightly. Whatever caused it, it was personal, angry, perhaps. Even jealous. Miss Marple stirred her tea. I find jealousy a most dangerous emotion, she said quietly. It's rarely about love, you know. More often it's about loss of control or fear of exposure. Lady Hawthorne tilted her head. Exposure? Of what? Oh, said Miss Marple, the past has a way of becoming awkward in the present, especially if one has tried too hard to erase it. No one responded. Later, over stewed apples in the drawing-room, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe Daphne Longhurst more closely. The girl sat near the window, half listening to Colonel Arbuthnot's tale of some military skirmish long ago. Her expression was tight, her fingers tugging unconsciously at the lace trim of her gloves. When Miss Marple approached, she looked up. I suppose this is what passes for excitement in Elderwood, Daphne said, trying for a wry tone. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. My dear, I've always found villages more dangerous than cities. Cities merely house criminals. Villages cultivate them. Daphne blinked. Do you really believe someone here did it? Someone we know? I believe that familiarity often masks resentment, and that a charming smile can be quite misleading. The girl lowered her eyes. He wasn't what people thought. Martin, he liked to stir things up, sometimes just for the fun of it. Did he ever stir things he oughtn't? Mrs. Marple asked softly. Daphne hesitated. Before she could reply, Mrs. Arbuthnot's voice rang out, calling everyone back into the garden for a final toast. The moment passed. Daphne rose, smoothing her dress, and walked away without answering. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression unreadable. A breeze rustled through the drawing-room window, carrying with it the scent of crushed thyme and rose petals. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a single thought took shape with growing certainty. Someone had killed Martin Trent not out of sudden rage, but out of necessity. And necessity in villages like Elderwood was always bound up in secrets. By Tuesday morning, the summer light over Elderwood had lost its golden softness. It filtered through a thin gauze of cloud, casting the village in a pallid, hesitant tone. The roses in the vicar's garden, so radiant only days before, now looked oddly brittle, their petals curling at the edges as if in silent mourning. Inside the police post, a modest brick building wedged between the greengrocer and the post office. Sergeant Cornish sat at his desk, his tea gone cold and his temper fraying. "I tell you it adds up," he said, tapping his pencil against a folder. Trent was pushing people's buttons, stirring trouble, flirting with women he had no business flirting with. If anyone had motive, it's him. Across the desk, Constable Nettle, a ruddy-faced young man with hay still clinging to his boots, frowned uncertainly. "But do you think Mr. Murgatroyd could have done it, sir? I mean, he's not the type keeps to himself. Hardly speaks above a mutter." "All the more reason," Cornish said grimly. "It's the quiet ones who bottle things up." "Maybe—" Trent provoked him. "Maybe he knew something. The lad was seen handing Trent an envelope last week behind the butcher's. That's a start. But we don't know what was in it." Cornish grunted. "No, but I intend to find out." And so Howard Murgatroyd, the gardener's son, 19 years old, awkward, and afflicted with a stammer, became Elderwood's first real suspect. News spread quickly. It always did. By midday, 3 different versions of the story were circulating. In the tea shop, Mrs. Craddock whispered that young Howard had confessed in tears. Over by the blacksmith's, someone said the envelope contained blackmail material. And at the village green, Lady Hawthorne herself was overheard saying the boy had a violent streak inherited from his father's side. None of it was confirmed, none of it accurate. But in Elderwood, truth had always been secondary. To conviction, Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. She sat that afternoon in her rose-covered parlor, darning a pair of socks while reviewing in her mind the mechanics of the murder. She had not yet formed a full picture, but one piece, the notion that young Howard Murgatroyd was capable of such a killing, simply didn't fit. "I've watched that boy prune rosebushes for years," she murmured aloud. "He weeps if he cuts a bloom too early. No, there's something else here." Her reverie was interrupted by a polite knock. It was Ellen Fitzwilliam, pale and nervous, holding a small wicker basket. "I brought scones," she said shyly. I didn't sleep well and thought I'd bake." Miss Marple welcomed her in with the kind warmth she reserved for those carrying food and burdened hearts. The 2 women sat by the lace-draped window, the basket between them. "You've had a trying few days," Miss Marple said gently. "I hope the village isn't being unkind." Ellen shook her head. "They mean well, mostly, but they're watching. I can feel it." "Because I found him, Martin, they think that means something." "Sometimes it does," Miss Marple replied. "And sometimes it means someone was merely in the wrong place at the right time. Tell me, Ellen, what brought you to the Arboretum that afternoon?" Ellen hesitated. I was looking for shade. My dress was too warm. I didn't think anyone else would be there." "You didn't see anyone on your way?" "No, just the roses and that awful hush, and then him." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I keep thinking maybe if I'd gone earlier, or later, maybe I would have missed it. Or maybe you would have seen the person who did it," Miss Marple said quietly. Ellen's eyes widened. "Do you think I was being watched?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She simply sipped her tea, then asked, "Did you ever quarrel with Mr. Trent?" Ellen flushed. "No, I mean he liked to talk, ask questions, personal questions sometimes. But he never hurt me." "You were fond of him?" "I don't know. Sometimes I was. Sometimes I hated him. He made me feel like I mattered. Then the next moment, like I was just something to be observed. Like he wasn't really looking at me." Miss Marple nodded. She had seen that look before in men who collected secrets for sport, not sentiment. That evening, Sergeant Cornish called for Miss Marple. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he admitted gruffly, after she had gently poked holes in his theory. "But the envelope, it is something. Found it in Trent's study this morning." "And?" Cornish retrieved a small, creased paper. It contained a brief note, typed, unsigned. "You may have fooled them, but I know who you are." "One more lie and I go to the papers," Miss Marple examined the paper. It had been folded with precision. The kind of fold one makes when intent on secrecy, not panic. "May I see the typewriter?" Cornish looked baffled. Typewriter? It was typed. Which means someone typed it. And I imagine Mr. Trent owned a typewriter, if only to maintain his illusion of novel writing. Cornish retrieved the machine from a canvas case. Miss Marple sat before it, fingers ghosting over the keys. She typed a few lines, then compared the ink and letter spacing with the note. "This wasn't typed on this machine," she said calmly. "See here, the lower loop of the G in the note is misaligned." "Not the case with this one," Cornish scowled. So the note was brought to him, hand-delivered. And likely by someone who didn't want it traced. I expect they wore gloves. He looked at her for a long moment. "If Howard didn't write it, he may have delivered it," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean he understood its contents." The note was folded to conceal its message. Cornish exhaled. "So we're back to nothing." Miss Marple stood. "Not nothing, Sergeant. We're back to the beginning, which is usually where the truth hides." Meanwhile, the village continued to feed on theories. "I heard he was after Daphne," murmured Mrs. Broomley to the vicar's wife. "Flirted shamelessly? Maybe someone didn't like it?" "I heard he was married," said the baker's assistant. "Secretly. Left his wife in Ireland. Came here for a fresh start or to hide?" But in her sitting room, Miss Marple focused on a different question entirely. What secret had Martin Trent threatened to expose, and to whom? She picked up her knitting. Her needles moved quietly. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. Sooner or later, someone would panic. Someone would say the wrong thing, reach for the wrong excuse, or try too hard to divert attention. And that, Miss Marple knew, was when the killer would begin to unravel. A hidden clue the following morning brought a rare crispness to the era shift in the weather that seemed to mirror the mood in Elderwood. The roses, though still blooming, appeared less eager now, as if aware that something darker had taken root among them. At Elderwood Hall, gardeners worked in near silence, clipping back the hedges and deadheading the blooms with a reverence more suited to a funeral. Life, in its dutiful English way, marched on, but in subdued tones and shortened greetings. Miss Marple, ever precise, arrived at the village library promptly at 10 o'clock. The library was a narrow brick building with tall arched windows and a persistent musty scent of old paper and floor polish. She greeted Miss Tremaine, the head librarian, with her usual warmth and settled at her preferred table near the bacca, spot with a direct view of both the entrance and the small alcove that housed the parish archives. Miss Marple wasn't there for fiction. She had, over the years, developed a quiet system of inquiry. When a question lingered in her mind, especially one that troubled the edges of reason, she often turned to the village's own memory, which was stored not just in people, but in documents, letters, and the fading ink of forgotten registers. Today she was thinking about handwriting, or rather the absence of it. The typed note found in Martin Trent's study, the one that had warned him of exposure, had occupied her thoughts all evening. Not for its threatening tone or even its secrecy, but because it wasn't handwritten. Most villagers in Elderwood, especially those of a certain generation, still relied on the intimacy of the pen. A letter, a warning, a rebuke, these were typically scratched out with a fountain pen and folded with the weight of emotion. To type such a note, especially so short a one, suggested someone accustomed to formality or deliberate concealment. Not just the avoidance of identification, but of personal emotional signature. And yet, even more peculiar was what she remembered of the envelope the note had arrived in. Or rather, what had been missing. No stamp, no postmark, no address. It had been hand-delivered. And that, to Miss Marple, was what pointed the way. She sifted through the parish newsletters of the last year, tedious reading to most, but not to her. In the June issue, she found what she was hoping for, a list of committee typists from the Rose Society and the Women's Relief Guild, 3 names. She smiled faintly. One had recently broken her wrist. One used a Remington, a brand with a distinctive typeface that did not match the note. And the third was Miss Anstruther. Prim, punctual, and never without gloves. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple wandered into the stationer's shop, a bell jingling softly as she stepped over the threshold. Behind the counter, Mr. Fielding was rearranging greeting cards by occasion: birthdays, anniversaries, condolences, and sympathy. "Miss Marple," he said with a respectful nod. "Haven't seen you in here in a while. What can I get you?" "Oh, I'm only browsing," she said lightly. "Though I did wonder, have you had many sales of plain cream envelopes lately? Not the kind with gold edges or floral lining? Just the unadorned sort?" Mr. Fielding furrowed his brow. "Well, I keep records, for restocking purposes. And we had a run on the plain sets 2 weeks ago. Sold a half-dozen packs in one day. Quite odd." Miss Marple raised her brows. "That is interesting. Do you recall who purchased them?" "Let me think. One was Lady Hawthorne. She uses them for formal invitations. And then, oh, Miss Anstruther. Came in twice that week, actually. Said she needed replacements. Very particular about her stationery, she is." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Fielding. That's most helpful." That evening she took tea at Daphne Longhurst's home. The Longhurst residence sat in a quiet lane just outside. The main village bordered by tall hedges and a creeping wisteria that half concealed the windows. Daphne answered the door herself, her hair loose, her expression guarded. "I wasn't expecting visitors," she said, though not unkindly. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple replied. "I only wondered how you were faring. These past few days have been difficult." Daphne hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The drawing room was filled with books and half-finished sketches. A teacup sat forgotten on a side table, and a sheaf of papers had slid onto the floor. Miss Marple bent gently to gather them. Sketches? I draw," Daphne said a little defensively. "Nothing professional, just when I need to think." The sketches were of garden scenes, mostly flowers, some paths and hedges. One, Miss Marple noted, was of the arboretum. It was accurate in detail, down to the cracked bench beneath the yew tree. But something was missing. "There's no bramble in this one," she said mildly, pointing at the right-hand edge. Daphne flushed. I suppose I forgot. Or left it out on purpose. It ruins the symmetry." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. They drank tea in near silence for several minutes before Daphne spoke again. "Do you believe Howard killed him?" she asked suddenly. "No," Miss Marple said, placing her cup in its saucer with great care. "I do not." Daphne nodded slowly. "Good, because I don't either. He was awkward, yes, but never cruel." "Did you know Martin well?" Daphne looked away. "I thought I did. But I think he saw people as parts to be played. He always wanted to know what you were hiding, what you regretted. And did he find yours?" There was a long pause. Then softly, "I don't know." Miss Marple gave a soft hum and patted the girl's hand. People rarely share all their regrets, even when invited. That night, back at her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. She now had something far more useful than a theory. She had a detail no one else had noticed. The lack of a bramble in the sketch, the choice of typed communication, the precise folds of the letter, the cream envelope without address, these were not fragments, but parts of a whole. Miss Anstruther. Or rather, who Miss Anstruther might be protecting. For Miss Marple had seen the type of gloves Miss Anstruther wore: thin, kid leather. Elegant, yes, but prone to retaining ink, smudges, or perhaps typewriter ribbon residue. She'd seen them worn through summer, even in a heat wave, never removed. She had once known a woman like that in St. Mary Mead. Secretive, cautious, in love with someone who did not return the affection, but who could be made to suffer for not doing so. The memory sparked something else, a conversation, days ago. Martin Trent had once said as he passed by, "Everyone here keeps secrets. The key is knowing which ones are dull and which are dangerous." Miss Marple now suspected he had found one of the dangerous ones. Rain pattered steadily across the rooftops of Elderwood, a fine mist drifting like a veil over the village green. The gloom settled in puddles and shadows, softening the edges of hedgerows and washing out the cheer of the summer blooms. It was Not just the weather that felt heavy, something darker pressed down upon Elderwood now, and it whispered through drawn curtains and half-shut doors. At the vicarage, the Reverend Thomas Wickley was staring out the window, untouched toast growing cold on his plate. His wife, Eleanor, placed a steaming cup beside him. "You haven't eaten." "No appetite, my dear," he said softly. "It feels as though something's been lost in the village. A sense of innocence." "You mean Martin Trent?" "I mean everything that's come with his death. Secrets are surfacing. Friendship's straining. I've heard whispers I'd never thought possible." She laid a hand on his shoulder. "They need leadership, Thomas. Calm, steady guidance." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Yes, and perhaps something more. Truth. The village must not be consumed by suspicion." He said it with resolve, but in his heart he too had questions. At Elderwood Hall, the once grand manor now wore an air of quiet tension. Inspector Walsh had returned to re-interview staff, though his tone had cooled somewhat from the initial fervor. In the drawing room, Mrs. Drayton, the housekeeper, stood stiffly before him. "I told you already," she said with clipped precision. "I was in the scullery during the incident, preparing luncheon for the garden party. I only came out when I heard Miss Daphne scream." "And you saw no one near the study beforehand?" Walsh asked. "No one suspicious." "And yet you didn't check the drawing room when you heard the front door open before the scream?" Mrs. Drayton's lips tightened. "Sir, there are many comings and goings in this house. Stuff, deliveries, guests. I don't investigate every sound. It isn't proper." Walsh jotted something in his notebook. "Tell me about Mr. Trent's relationships with the staff. Was he well liked?" The housekeeper hesitated, a moment too long. "He respected discipline." "That can be mistaken for coldness, but not affection?" "No." Walsh glanced up. "And what about Miss Anstruther?" Mrs. Drayton gave a tight smile. "Miss Anstruther holds herself apart. She expects the same in return." Meanwhile, at Fernley Cottage, Miss Marple hosted an afternoon tea for Colonel Bertram Weston and Mrs. Leslie Cummings, both longtime residents and keen observers of Elderwood's inner workings. "I do appreciate your invitation," Leslie said as she settled on the floral chintz settee. "With everything going on, it's nice to remember that some traditions haven't vanished." Miss Marple smiled benignly as she poured the tea. "Yes, well, there's nothing like a bit of Darjeeling to settle the nerves." Colonel Weston adjusted his waistcoat and cleared his throat. "I've served in 2 wars and been shot. At more times than I care to count, but I must say, this business has everyone rattled. Never liked Trent, but murder's a different matter." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And what didn't you like about him, Colonel?" "Oh, he was clever, too clever. Knew how to needle people. Always prying, asking questions with a smile that made your spine crawl." Leslie sipped her tea delicately. "And the way he behaved at the garden party, so smug. I heard he said something dreadful to poor Daphne." Miss Marple looked up with polite curiosity. "Oh?" Leslie leaned in. She went pale and stormed off toward the orchard just before. "You know, I don't know what he said, but she was trembling." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. "He did have a certain way of drawing out truths. And people do so dislike their truths being exposed." Colonel Weston grunted. "Wouldn't surprise me if half the village had reason to see him off." Still, Miss Marple echoed gently. Only one person acted upon it. Across the village, Howard Trent was packing a small suitcase at his mother's house, where he had been staying since the night of the murder. His hands trembled as he folded shirts with excessive care. "I don't see why you're leaving," Mrs. Trent snapped, her gray bun taut and her voice sharper than usual. "You'll only make people think you're guilty." "I'm not," he said quietly, "but I'm tired of the looks, the whispers." "You're not a coward, Howard." "No," he said, "just a fool." Mrs. Trent froze. "What do you mean?" Howard sat on the edge of the bed. "Martin knew about the money I borrowed, about other things. He hinted he'd tell the trustees. I would have been ruined." His mother's face twisted. "You didn't know, I swear it, but I wanted to." "That's the truth of it. I wanted him gone." He dropped his head into his hands. Miss Marple's walk took her past the post office, where Mr. Crispin, the postmaster, was sorting bundles of mail with slow, deliberate movements. She entered with a pleasant nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crispin. I do hope the rain hasn't soaked your spirits." "Drizzles don't bother me, Miss Marple," he said. "But this business with Mr. Trent's turned everything upside down." "Yes," she agreed softly, "and yet some things still go on as they always do." She drifted her fingers along the edge of the counter, eyes scanning the posted notices. "Tell me, do you recall any hand-delivered letters to Elderwood Hall in the last few weeks? Perhaps someone asking to bypass the normal post?" Mr. Crispin tilted his head. "Now that you mention it." Miss Anstruther came in and asked about delivery services. "Wanted to know if we had a courier for private correspondence." "Oh?" "Said it was for something sensitive, related to her position. I told her we don't do that." She left. "Looking frustrated?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "Very interesting. Thank you." By evening, word had spread Daphne Longhurst and Lady Hawthorne had a very public disagreement near the baker's. Mrs. Pettigrew, who witnessed the exchange, related over the counter at the grocer's. "Plain as day," she said, leaning in. Lady Hawthorne accused her of hiding something. Side Martin had told her Daphne was harboring deceit. Daphne nearly slapped her. "What sort of deceit?" someone asked. Mrs. Pettigrew lowered her voice. "No one knows, but Lady Hawthorne said Martin was about to out her, and that Daphne had run from the truth too long." Miss Marple, selecting apples nearby, said nothing, but her fingers paused briefly over a bruised gala. That night, as lamps flickered on across Elderwood and the wind rustled through hedges with uneasy whispers, Miss Marple wrote a single word in her notebook: exposures. Then beneath it, a list of names, not suspects yet but people with secrets: Howard Trent, financial ruin and envy. Daphne Longhurst, emotional entanglements, hinted guilt. Miss Anstruther, stationery, concealment, emotional repression. Mrs. Drayton, too precise, too rehearsed. Lady Hawthorne knows more than she says, possibly manipulating. None of them were without motive. But motive alone was insufficient. There had to be a moment, a human misstep, small and fleeting, that betrayed the truth. And Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and quiet eyes, was waiting to catch it. Another twist the storm passed during the night, but its residue lingered in Elderwood's damp lanes and thick skies. Morning came sluggishly, pale sunlight filtering through the last tatters of cloud, glinting on wet cobblestones and trembling flower petals. But it wasn't the rain-soaked hedgerows that kept villagers indoors this morning, it was fear. Fear, sharpened and clarified, with the news that another crime had disturbed Elderwood's uneasy peace. At precisely 6:45 a.m., old Mr. Finchley, the gardener at Elderwood Hall, found something in the orangery that chilled him more than the autumn dew. His shouts brought Mrs. Drayton, who gasped and clutched her chest when she entered and saw it, the broken body of Lady Hawthorne, crumpled at the foot of the stone stairs leading to the upper terrace. By 9:15 a.m., Inspector Walsh had returned to the estate, his face tight with both alarm and frustration. 2 deaths in as many days, he muttered, and this one even less expected. He walked slowly across the orangery tiles, examining the pattern of broken pottery and blood. The wide glass structure, lined with citrus trees and geraniums, was a place of warmth and leisure. But now it smelled faintly of iron and crushed lemon leaves. A single overturned flower pot lay near. Lady Hawthorne's outstretched hand. Dr. Mercer, the village physician, straightened after examining the body. Neck broken, consistent with a fall. But, Walsh raised an eyebrow, but she wasn't wearing shoes. She often came here in the early morning, Mrs. Drayton explained quietly. In her dressing gown and slippers. Claimed. The air helped her migraines. Did she come alone? Always. No one else would be awake yet. Miss Marple had arrived quietly, as she always did, without fanfare. Now she stood to the side, her hands folded neatly before her. Her eyes swept the scene, lingering not on the body but the details, the unbroken teacup beside a chair, the trailing scarf near the railing, the odd angle of a cracked fern pot. She must have slipped, Walsh said, more to himself than anyone. Dr. Mercer looked unconvinced. Perhaps, or was pushed. News spread fast, as it always did in Elderwood. At Greystone's tea room, the villagers whispered between sips of tea and buttered scones. She was upset yesterday, murmured Mrs. Harding, eyes darting. Had that row with Daphne, didn't she? And you heard what she said about Martin? Chimed Mr. Togan, the butcher. That he told her something shocking. Maybe she couldn't live with it. Or maybe someone didn't want her to tell anyone else, said a younger man near the counter. His tone was sharp. She knew something. That's why she's dead. There was silence after that, heavy and uncomfortable. At Fernley Cottage, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Walsh over a modest breakfast of marmalade toast and weak tea. The inspector had finally begun seeking her company, if not her counsel, though he would never admit the latter outright. "You think the two deaths are connected?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Miss Marple blinked slowly. "Well, it would be quite a coincidence otherwise, wouldn't it?" But Hawthorne had no enemies, not like Trent. "Perhaps," she said gently. "She had one, the same one." He frowned. "You think she saw something? Or heard something? Or knew something, which in some ways can be even more dangerous?" Walsh tapped his fingers on the table. "There was that business with Miss Longhurst. And she and Trent spoke privately at the garden party, didn't they?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He had a talent for confrontation. She had a talent for veiled threats. One might say they were well matched. But what would tie her to the study, to that moment?" Miss Marple refilled his cup. "I wonder if the same thing tied Martin to it. Truth. Or the threat of it." That afternoon, Daphne Longhurst sat in her garden, cheeks pale beneath a thick layer of powder, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her maid Lillian hovered nearby with silent concern. "You needn't fuss," Daphne said. "It's just nerves." "I could fetch the doctor, miss. Dr. Mercer could give you something calming." "No," Daphne snapped. "No doctors." "No more men asking questions," Lillian hesitated. "It's just two deaths in the village. And both close to you. People talk." Daphne's mouth twitched. "Let them. I'm used to gossip." "But if there's something you know—" "I don't," she said, rising abruptly. "I don't know anything." She turned sharply and strode into the house. But once inside, in the privacy of the drawing room, her composure broke. She opened a desk drawer and retrieved an envelope marked and yellowing at the corners. She stared at it, then placed it back, hands trembling. Later that evening, Miss Marple called on Miss Anstruther, who had returned to the hall earlier in the day. The governess answered the door herself. "Goodness," she said stiffly, "I'm afraid it's not a good time." "I do apologize." "Dear," Miss Marple said, "but I wanted to ask you a small question. Do you recall what Lady Hawthorne was reading the day of the garden party?" Miss Anstruther blinked. "Reading?" "She had a magazine with her, I think. Something on modern architecture." "And did she leave it behind?" "I don't know. Why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, just curiosity. I recall something about hidden doors. Quite fascinating. Don't you think?" She didn't wait for an answer, but as she turned to leave, she noticed the glint of something shiny just inside the hallway, a shoe buckle gold and delicately engraved. Lady Hawthorne's. Why had it been left behind? By dusk, Walsh returned to the hall for a final sweep of the orangery. As he stood under the glass dome, light fading around him, something nagged at him. He examined the stairs again. There was something unnatural about the smear of dirt along the banister, a faint groove like the edge of a rubber sole dragged down. He stepped carefully, lifting the pot where the scarf had lain earlier. Inside it was a broken piece of ivory-colored ceramic. He lifted it, the handle of a teacup. Then he saw the faint trace of red on the shard, lipstick. Elsewhere, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with her knitting resting idle in her lap. The shadows stretched long across the carpet as evening descended. Her face was thoughtful, eyes closed, not asleep, but remembering. She pictured Lady Hawthorne's face the last time she saw it, drawn but determined. She remembered the tightness around Miss Anstruther's mouth when asked about deliveries. The crumpled envelope in Daphne's hand, Howard's trembling honesty. And always Martin Trent's voice, needling, prying, uncovering. Everyone had secrets. The difference was who was willing to protect theirs and at what cost. In her notebook she added 2 more words beneath exposures. Silence, fear, then underlined once, cover-up. It was a soft and subdued morning in Elderwood, with a hush that lingered as though the village itself was holding its breath. The mist had returned, blanketing hedgerows and rooftops, muting the sounds of birdsong and footsteps alike. And yet, for all its quiet, Elderwood was bristling with tension. 2 deaths so different, yet now inextricably linked, cast long shadows on the villagers' routines. Conversations paused when certain names were mentioned. Curtains fluttered at the sound of a knock. And all the while, Miss Marple moved gently through it all, as unnoticed as a breeze, yet missing nothing. By now, her notebook was thick with carefully written lines and observations. Not facts precisely, at least. Not in the way Inspector Walsh might catalogue them, but patterns, motives, reactions, the way someone's gaze had flicked at a question, with subtle hesitation in a reply. Most people believed the truth resided in evidence. Miss Marple knew better. It resided in behavior. And today she intended to watch someone very closely indeed. Miss Marple had sent her invitation early that morning, charming, handwritten, and innocuous. A brief note to Miss Daphne Longhurst, asking her to tea that afternoon. Nothing formal, simply a quiet chat and perhaps a slice of Victoria sponge. Miss Marple made a point of including the phrase soothing company and chose her softest paper. It was not entirely unexpected that Daphne accepted. She arrived at Fernley Cottage a little after 4, dressed in a pale mint coat and dove gray. Gloves, both immaculate. Her eyes, however, betrayed a certain tiredness of brittleness just beneath the painted calm. "Dear Miss Longhurst," Miss Marple said warmly, ushering her in. "I do hope you're holding up well." "As well as one can, given the circumstances," Daphne replied, smoothing her skirt. "It's all been rather dreadful." "Yes, poor Lady Hawthorne. And of course Mr. Trent? I dare say none of us were prepared for 2 tragedies in such quick succession." Miss Marple offered tea, which Daphne accepted with a polite nod. Her movements were composed, her voice controlled, yet every so often her hand lingered too long on her cup. She flinched slightly when a door creaked. These were not the signs of simple grief, they were signs of strain, of pressure. "I often find that tea restores the nerves," Miss Marple said gently. "Especially after sleepless nights." Daphne blinked. "I haven't slept badly." "Oh, no, of course not. But I do recall that dreadful fire at the Croft years ago. Do you remember?" Mrs. Penbury said she didn't sleep a wink for a week. She said it wasn't the fire itself, but what it reminded her of. Quite an odd turn of phrase, don't you think? Daphne stared at her for a second too long. "I wouldn't know." "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured, adding sugar to her tea. There was a pause, delicate and brimming. Then Miss Marple said, in that same unassuming tone, "I heard you and Mr. Trent had a somewhat tense exchange at the garden party? Something about a letter?" Daphne's cup froze mid-air. "I wouldn't call it tense," she said slowly. "He was always dramatic. I tried to avoid his provocations." "I quite agree," Miss Marple said with a little smile. "He did have a way of making people nervous. Always looking behind the curtain, as it were." Daphne placed her cup down. "Why all these questions?" "Oh, I don't mean to interrogate you, my dear. I was simply curious. I've often found that in small villages we rarely take the time to understand one another, even though we believe we do." Daphne relaxed slightly, though the tension had not completely vanished. Miss Marple set down her cup. "May I show you something?" Without waiting for an answer, she retrieved a small silver compact from a nearby table and passed it to Daphne. Daphne frowned. "What is it?" "It belonged to Lady Hawthorne. Found at the foot of the terrace stairs. I thought you might help identify it since you were so close." Daphne turned it over. Her eyes darted and her hand trembled just. slightly as she examined the tiny, worn initials. LH, then she froze. This wasn't hers, she said quickly. She didn't carry compacts like this. No? Miss Marple asked, voice light. I had thought it looked rather like the one she used at the garden party. I noticed her reapplying her lipstick quite determinedly just before her conversation with you. Daphne stiffened. That doesn't prove anything. I quite agree, said Miss Marple. But it did make me wonder why she was so nervous that day, and why someone would try to wipe off a trace of lipstick from a cup shard found near the orangery. An odd thing to do after an accident. Daphne's complexion drained of color. I don't know what you're implying. Nothing, dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Nothing at all. Though I did wonder, just a wondering. You understand why someone might visit Lady Hawthorne late the night before her death? Particularly if they feared she might tell Inspector Walsh about something they'd done, or were afraid she knew. There was silence in the parlor. Daphne's voice was barely above a whisper. She was going to ruin me. Miss Marple inclined her head. She said she would show the letter to the trustees, Daphne continued, voice shaking. That she would destroy everything I'd built. Oh, for the sake of some ancient scandal. Miss Marple said nothing, merely watching. I begged her not to, Daphne said, but she didn't care. She hated me ever since I got engaged to her son. She said I was beneath him. The emotion in her voice cracked, real and raw. I went to talk to her, just to talk. But she was in one of her states raving. She said she'd go to the police about Martin's death too. Saw it I'd encouraged it, manipulated him. And had you? Miss Marple asked, her voice still gentle. Daphne didn't answer. She stood, turned away toward the window. I didn't push her, she said at last. She slipped, a beat. But you didn't call for help? Silence again. Finally, Daphne whispered, No. Miss Marple stood. Grief can cloud judgment, fear more so. But the truth, Miss Longhurst, has a way of rising, and I dare say it already has. Later that evening, Inspector Walsh listened with grim concentration as Miss Marple relayed the encounter in precise, unfussy detail. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, digesting the implication. She didn't confess. Not directly, no, Miss Marple said. But guilt often doesn't need words. It was quite clear in her eyes and her hesitation. She be brought in? We'll need to verify everything. Of course. Walsh leaned back, exhaling. Still, there's something off about all this. 2 deaths, and even if one was accidental, I feel like we're still missing something. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. You may be right. She rose, retrieving her knitting. Because, you see, she added quietly, not all lies are told with words, and not all murderers act alone. The reveal rain began to fall over Elderwood as dusk slipped in like a velvet curtain, muffling the edges of the village's Georgian chimneys and ivy-covered walls. The lane in front of Fernley Cottage was slick and shining in the gaslight, and the only sound to be heard was the soft hiss of water on leaves. It was a night built for secrets, for the quiet closing of doors, and whispered voices behind lace curtains. But within Miss Marple's sitting room, the atmosphere was far from tranquil. Inspector Walsh stood with arms folded, his brow furrowed deeply as he stared at the compact lying on the tea-tray. Lady Hawthorne's silver compact. The one Daphne had claimed was not hers, despite clear indications otherwise. I can bring her in, he said at last, on obstruction if nothing else. There's enough to question her properly. Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting once again in hand, merely nodded. I do believe Miss Longhurst has been dishonest, though not necessarily in the way we first imagined. Walsh turned to face her. How do you mean? Miss Marple paused, her fingers resting lightly on a loop of yarn. Well, Inspector, it strikes me that Miss Longhurst has been very careful with her words. She said she didn't push Lady Hawthorne, that she didn't call for help. But nowhere. Did she say she was alone? Walsh's eyes narrowed. You're saying she had help? No, Miss Marple said gently. I'm saying someone else was involved, but not in the way we think. It was never simply about inheritance or jealousy, it was about fear. And that sort of fear, real fear, leads to poor decisions. But Not necessarily murder. Walsh scratched his chin. She did seem, oh, nervous, but not like a cold-blooded killer. Miss Marple looked up. That's because she didn't kill Lady Hawthorne. She simply let her die. There was a pause. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. You think someone else was there that night? Walsh asked. I do. But who? Miss Marple sighed, standing and moving toward a shelf lined with delicate porcelain figurines. Lady Hawthorne was not a well-liked woman, that's clear. She held power over nearly everyone in the village, not through force, but through knowledge. She knew things about Daphne, yes. About her own son. But also about her companion, Miss Finch, about Reverend Cartwright, and about someone else, someone she never spoke of publicly. Miss Marple turned, eyes bright despite the soft wrinkles around them. Someone who was terribly afraid of her, afraid she might speak of things long buried. Walsh watched her intently. You believe there's another motive entirely? I do, but the clue isn't in what was said. It's in what was done, or rather, what was hidden. She crossed to her bureau and opened a small drawer. From within, she drew out a piece of folded paper, a note. Its creases were crisp, but the ink had bled slightly, suggesting it had been hastily written and perhaps dampened. I found this tucked beneath a drawer in Lady Hawthorne's writing desk, she said. Our dear vicar's wife invited me in earlier this week to collect her lacework. She's taken up embroidery to calm her nerves. In the process, she mentioned Lady Hawthorne had kept an odd habit of hiding bits of correspondence in the wrong drawers, fearing the staff might read them. She unfolded the note and handed it to Walsh. He read aloud, If you say a word about 1932, I will deny everything. We both know what happened. And I won't be ruined because you suddenly feel moral. The note was unsigned. Walsh frowned. What happened in 1932? That, Miss Marple said quietly, is precisely the question. But I believe someone besides Miss Longhurst had something to lose, something greater than reputation. Something tied to survival. She leaned forward, her voice calm and steady. I believe Lady Hawthorne was blackmailing someone else. And I believe it's that person who ultimately ensured her silence. Walsh stared into the fire for a long moment. You've got someone in mind? I do, but I need one more confirmation. She lifted her teacup and sipped, letting the silence grow. Then she added softly, I would very much like to invite everyone involved to tea, here, tomorrow. Afternoon. Walsh raised an eyebrow. A parlor trap? Not a trap, Inspector, Miss Marple said with a ghost of a smile. A test of behavior. The next day dawned overcast and heavy with the scent of damp earth. By 3 o'clock, a small, tense group had assembled in Miss Marple's sitting room. Daphne Longhurst sat pale and composed, clutching a handkerchief in her lap. Miss Beatrice Finch, Lady Hawthorne's longtime companion, sat near the window, her eyes sunken and unreadable. Reverend Cartwright, his collar slightly askew, fiddled with his watch chain, while Colonel Weatherby stared into the fire with the stiff patience of someone long practiced in military diplomacy. The final guest arrived a few minutes late, Mrs. Helen Bright, the village's quiet librarian, who looked more startled than anyone to have been invited. Miss Marple, looking as serene as ever, poured tea for them all. I do thank you all for coming, she said sweetly. It's simply that I felt the time had come to bring a little clarity to these distressing circumstances. She handed a cup to Mrs. Bright and watched carefully as the woman took it with both hands. Lady Hawthorne's death was, we now believe, not an accident at all, Miss Marple said quietly. She was frightened. And fear, as we know, makes people act erratically. But it wasn't Miss Longhurst she was most afraid of. She let the words hang in the air. She had begun to suspect she had made a mistake years ago. In trusting someone who betrayed her in 1932, there was the faintest twitch in Mrs. Bright's hands. A woman was struck by a motor car in London that year. She survived, but lost her memory. I believe Lady Hawthorne paid for her to be institutionalized under another name. I believe it was done to keep certain family secrets hidden, particularly about an inheritance. Mrs. Bright set her cup down. I don't know what you mean, she said, too quickly. "Oh, but I think you do," Miss Marple replied. "Because it was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Bright? You were that woman." Lady Hawthorne's late husband had a prior entanglement. A child. That child was you. Everyone stared. She didn't tell anyone, not even her son. She arranged for you to live elsewhere under a new identity. But when you regained your memory, you came to Elderwood quietly. You became the librarian. You waited. But Lady Hawthorne had begun to feel the pressure. And when she threatened to expose you, you knew what it would mean. You were already barely holding on. Mrs. Bright's voice cracked. She said she'd take it all away. My job, my name, my life. She said I was a fraud. She may have been cruel, Miss Marple said, but you were desperate. You followed her that night. You didn't intend to kill her, but when she slipped, you let it happen. And you made sure it looked like an accident? Tears welled in Mrs. Bright's eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. I just wanted her to be quiet. There was silence. Then gently Miss Marple rose and touched her shoulder. I know, she said softly. But silence purchased in fear never lasts. And the truth always eventually finds its voice. It was curious, Miss Marple often thought, how quickly a village could resume its rhythm after the shattering of its tranquility. Elderwood, for all its gossip and rustling curtains, was a resilient little place. A death, even a murder, seemed to be absorbed into its soil like autumn leaves, broken down into whispers, sidelong glances, and eventually silence. And yet, for those who had lived through it closely, the echoes never fully faded. The days following Mrs. Helen Bright's quiet confession passed in a soft fog. The news never made it to the London papers. Inspector Walsh, ever practical and discreet, had taken Mrs. Bright into custody with remarkable gentleness. There was no trial, not a public one anyway. A private hearing was held, and considerations were made for her mental health and the years she had spent under the shadow of another woman's control. Lady Hawthorne's influence, even in death, still had a long reach. I'm told they've placed her in a sanatorium outside of Bath, Miss Marple remarked to her friend, Mrs. Weatherby. One morning as they strolled the narrow lane between the post office and the baker's. Oh, the poor thing, Mrs. Weatherby said, adjusting her gloves. You know, I always thought there was something a little tremulous about her. Like a bird that had lost its nest. Now we know why, I suppose. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. There's always a reason for trembling, even if it's well hidden. They passed Reverend Cartwright's vicarage. Its hedges were neatly clipped, the garden well tended, yet something about the house seemed subdued now, the curtains more firmly drawn. The Reverend had preached the following Sunday, his sermon quiet and reflective, filled with solemn tones of forgiveness and the weight of conscience. It was, Miss Marple noted, one of his better efforts. As for Daphne Longhurst, she had not returned to the hall since the day of the tea-gathering. She was staying with cousins in Surrey, it was said, for a rest and recovery. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, was a bit more nuanced. Daphne had been complicit, in a way allowing Lady Hawthorne to fall, hiding the compact, withholding information. But the law had not pursued her. Perhaps it was because her silence had been born of fear rather than malice. Or perhaps because Miss Marple, in her understated but persuasive way, had urged compassion. She has lived under that woman's shadow. Since she was 17, Miss Marple had told Inspector Walsh, I don't condone her actions, but I understand them. Walsh had nodded, grim but agreeing. She'd have to live with it. That's often the harsher sentence. The village itself turned the page with cautious relief. Whispers in the grocer's turned from murder back to mundane matters, the rising price of butter, the upcoming church fete, and the odd rumor that the new baker's assistant was courting the postmistress's niece. Life as ever marched on. And yet, in the quiet corners of Elderwood, something had shifted. At Elmwood Cottage, Miss Finch continued to reside, her thin figure a familiar sight along the garden paths. Her devotion to Lady Hawthorne had been genuine, even if, in hindsight, misguided. She had not been complicit in the blackmail or cruelty, but she had known more than she let on. Perhaps even suspected the extent of her mistress's secrets. But loyalty, Miss Marple knew, often made fools of clever women. One afternoon, Miss Marple invited her for tea. "It's strange," Miss Finch said softly, stirring her cup without looking up. "To wake up each day and not have her voice calling from the next room. I don't know who I am, really, without her." "You are a woman who survived," Miss Marple replied gently. "And that, Miss Finch, is a most remarkable thing." There was silence for a moment. "She didn't deserve to die like that," Miss Finch said at last. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But few people ever do, and very few die precisely as they deserve." They parted with an air of tentative healing. Miss Finch, it seemed, had begun the long process of rediscovering herself, not as a shadow of someone else, but as a person with thoughts, preferences, and perhaps in time, peace. Peace. The village green shimmered under early morning dew a week later, and Miss Marple found herself seated once again in the garden of Fernley Cottage, this time with her nephew, Raymond West, the novelist, who had come down from London to check on his aunt. "I don't know how you do it, Aunt Jane," he said, watching a squirrel dart across the lawn. "You always seem to know who did it before anyone else has even realized something's happened." Miss Marple smiled, her hands wrapped around her teacup. "Oh, Raymond, it's not cleverness, not as you understand it. It's simply a matter of watching. People are always revealing things if you know where to look. The way they sit, the things they don't say, their inconsistencies." Raymond chuckled. "You make it sound like people are all stories waiting to be deciphered. Isn't that what you believe as a writer?" He tilted his head. "Fair point." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the quiet of the garden disturbed only by the rustling of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. "Do you think she'd be all right, Mrs. Bright?" he asked eventually. "I hope so," Miss Marple said. "She was a woman who had her life taken from her long before she did anything wrong. When that happens, when people are denied their truths, it warps them, sometimes beyond recognition." Raymond frowned. "You're very forgiving." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though there was a shadow of sadness there. "No, dear. I'm just very old. And I've seen what happens when people are punished too harshly for the wrong reasons. Sometimes the justice we seek is not what helps the world move on." Raymond nodded, thoughtful. "You should write a book, Aunt Jane." She laughed lightly. "Oh, heavens no, that's your gift. Mine is baking, gardening, and the occasional bit of sleuthing." He grinned. "More than occasional, I'd say." Later that evening, after Raymond had gone and the sun had slipped behind the willows lining the riverbank, Miss Marple took her embroidery hoop and sat by the fire. The clock ticked steadily and the house felt wrapped in stillness. A book of poems sat beside her, and her cat, Chesterton, purred quietly by her feet. She thought of the people of Elderwood, of Daphne Longhurst somewhere nursing her regrets, of Miss Finch and her solitude, of Mrs. Bright in a quiet room outside Bath, perhaps sleeping for the first time without nightmares, of the villagers, their routines intact yet forever altered by what they had witnessed. And she thought, not for the first time, that murder never occurred in a vacuum. It was always born of something: fear, pain, secrets too long hidden. The act itself was only the echo of a much older violence. Human nature, she whispered to herself, threading her needle. Such a complicated business. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy on the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 9. Miss Marple bent to her embroidery and, with precise care, began to stitch a small rose. The shadows of Elderwood. Though Miss Marple had always trusted that quiet would return to Elderwood after a crime had been solved, she also knew better than to assume that quiet meant peace. A week after Mrs. Bright had been taken away, the village had all but returned to its tidy rhythm. The shops opened promptly, Reverend Cartwright's bell rang on time, and the cows at the Greaves farm lowed as they always had. And yet something did not quite sit right with Miss Marple. It wasn't a concrete doubt. There were no more bodies, no screams in the dark, no new whispers of wrongdoing. No, what unsettled her was the feeling of a shadow passing behind a curtain, something not quite glimpsed but unmistakably real. She had long learned to trust such instincts. That very afternoon Miss Marple received a visitor, Lucy Braddock, the grocer's daughter, whose youthful face bore none of the usual carefree cheer it typically did when she stopped by to deliver eggs. "Come in, dear," Miss Marple said, kindly ushering the girl inside. "You look pale as cream. Sit down and have a scone." Lucy perched delicately on the edge of the chair, her hands in her lap, twisting a handkerchief into threads. "I shouldn't be troubling you, Miss Marple, but I don't know who else to speak to." Miss Marple poured tea with the gentleness of a hostess and the attentiveness of a confessor. "Trouble doesn't always knock on doors politely, Lucy. Sometimes we have to listen to it even when it whispers." Lucy looked down. "It's about Daphne Longhurst." Miss Marple looked up sharply, though her tone remained even. "Oh, I saw her, Miss Marple, yesterday here in Elderwood." There was a pause, but I was told she had gone to Surrey, to her cousins, Miss Marple said carefully. "That's what I thought too," Lucy whispered. "But I was walking through the wood at the edge of Hawthorne Hall, near the old gardener's path, and I saw someone standing beneath the yew tree there. At first, I thought it was one of the new caretakers, but when she turned Miss Marple, I know it was Miss Daphne. She looked right at me and then vanished into the trees." Miss Marple sat back, a finger tapping her teacup lightly. "Are you quite certain it was her?" Lucy nodded fervently. "I'd swear to it." "Miss—" Marple remained quiet for a moment. The old yew tree Lucy had mentioned, an ancient, twisted thing that stood like a sentinel near the servants' entrance to Hawthorne Hall, had long been a place children avoided, and where, it was said, Lady Hawthorne used to have her most private conversations. Daphne returning there? It seemed odd, and yet there was something compelling about it. "Thank you, Lucy," Miss Marple said at last, gently. "You've done just right in coming to me." That night Miss Marple's thoughts were crowded with questions. Why would Daphne return to Elderwood in secret? What had drawn her back? And more to the point, why had she not made herself known? She was not, Miss Marple reflected, convinced that Daphne had told the whole truth on that dreadful afternoon. Something about her behavior had struck Miss Marple as theatrical, not insincere, but performed, as though the horror and grief had served to conceal another emotion entirely, something far more private. The next morning, Miss Marple took it upon herself to call at Hawthorne Hall. It was a strange place now, both familiar and alien. With Lady Hawthorne gone, the grandeur of the estate had lost its cold center. The staff had mostly gone as well, leaving only a pair of temporary caretakers, Mr. and Mrs. Giles, who had been hired by the estate lawyers to manage the transition. The house was cold and echoing, its polished corridors full of ghosts. Mrs. Giles, a short, round woman with tightly curled hair and the air of someone perpetually annoyed by dust, greeted Miss Marple at the side entrance. "Terribly sorry." "Miss Marple," she said after leading her into the kitchen, "we haven't had visitors, not since, well, you know. Most of the rooms are shut up now. The lawyers are deciding what to do." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said politely. "I was simply wondering if you or your husband had noticed anything unusual lately." "Any unexpected guests? Strange noises, lights in the garden?" Mrs. Giles raised an eyebrow. "Now that you mention it, my husband did say the dogs barked madly 2 nights ago, around midnight. He went out with the lantern but found nothing." "And have you seen Miss Longhurst?" The woman's eyes widened slightly. "No." "Lord." "No, though I expect she may try to return. She was practically raised in this place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "May I have a brief look at the gardens?" "I won't be long." The gardens of Hawthorne Hall had once been immaculate, arranged with military precision under Lady Hawthorne's hawk-like supervision. Now they were fading, though not yet wild. The gravel paths were scattered with early autumn leaves, and the hedges were just beginning to overgrow. Miss Marple moved with careful steps, past the rose trellises and the herb border, until she reached the yew. It stood, as it always had, tall and brooding, its dark branches curved like bony fingers over the path. Here the air seemed cooler, somehow quieter, as if the tree absorbed sound. Miss Marple paused. A faint depression in the grass, a cigarette and foreign, unfiltered. Daphne didn't smoke, but someone had stood here recently. Watched, perhaps. And just behind the yew, in a hollow of earth near the root, something caught her eye. She knelt and gently brushed the soil aside. A scrap of torn paper, aged and yellowing, folded into quarters. She opened it. The writing was faded, written in a hurried, slanting hand. Most of the ink had bled, but a few words remained. She knows about the painting. If I disappear, look under. The rest was illegible. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment, the wind brushing through the leaves above her. This changed things. When she returned home, she took out a small notebook and wrote 3 names. Daphne Longhurst, Miss Finch. The painting, she drew a thin line connecting them. Miss Marple rarely worked from conjecture, but now she felt the stirrings of something. Deeper, the confession of Mrs. Bright may have closed one door, but it appeared that another had quietly swung open. Perhaps Daphne had returned not just out of grief, but out of fear. And if so, it raised a question that had yet to be answered. What was hidden in Elderwood that someone still wanted to keep buried? The morning after her quiet discovery behind the yew tree, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting needles in hand, though her wool had barely moved in 20 minutes. The note from the hollow near the roots of that ancient tree replayed in her mind. She knows about the painting. If I disappear, look under. The rest had been lost to water, time, and earth, but it was enough to wonder what painting? And what had Daphne, or perhaps someone else, feared might be uncovered? She needed knowledge, not just of the Hawthorne family's recent history, but of the older, dustier stories that lived in the back rooms of memory, the sort of thing, not recorded in ledgers but whispered over tea and passed down with guarded glances. And there was no one in Elderwood better for that sort of recollection than Miss Clara Finch. Miss Finch, sprightly despite her 79 years and fiercely observant, had once been Lady Hawthorne's personal secretary, companion. The lady had insisted, though most understood the power dynamic was rather more rigid. Clara had remained in Elderwood after retiring some 20 years ago, her little cottage crammed with yellowing books, lacquered tea sets, and a remarkable capacity for remembering things others had forgotten. Miss Marple tucked the folded note into her reticule, finished tying her shawl, and set off. Miss Finch's cottage stood nestled on Primrose Lane, its small front garden filled with chrysanthemums and bees. The older woman opened the door with her usual briskness, her mouth pursed and eyes narrowed in appraisal. "Jane Marple," she said. "Something stirring, then?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "May I come in for a few minutes, Clara? I find myself curious about something I thought you might help illuminate." Inside, the air was tinged with lavender and old paper. They settled by the window with tea, and Miss Marple carefully steered the conversation past the recent drama surrounding Mrs. Bright and toward more historical waters. "Did you ever happen to see any unusual artwork at Hawthorne Hall?" she asked after a suitable preamble. "Something perhaps hidden away or taken down?" Clara arched a thin brow. "My dear, that place was a veritable museum. Portraits, landscapes, some positively dreadful allegorical scenes, but unusual?" Miss Marple waited, sipping her tea quietly. "Well," Clara said, her voice lowering a little, "there was one painting. It wasn't displayed in the main gallery or drawing rooms, no. It was kept in the blue salon, locked up most of the time. Lady Hawthorne didn't care for it being discussed. What was it of?" Clara hesitated, her teacup halfway to her mouth. "A woman," she said at last, "but not like the others. It wasn't an ancestral portrait or commissioned work. It looked like it had been done in haste. Very emotional, almost frantic. Some said it was of Mr. Hawthorne's mistress." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I didn't know he had one." "Oh, it was before Daphne's time," Clara said. "Just after the war. The story went that he fell for a village girl lower class, though I always found that distinction a bit overemphasized. She was clever, well-read. They said he meant to leave Lady Hawthorne for her." "Did he?" "No, the girl disappeared." Miss Marple didn't respond right away. "And the painting?" "It vanished not long after the girl did. Rumor was Lady Hawthorne had it removed, burned perhaps. But I always thought that unlikely. She wouldn't destroy something so useful. A pause. What do you mean, useful? Miss Marple asked gently. Clara's expression was unreadable for a moment. Then she said, to remind people who was truly in charge. Walking home from Miss Finch's, Miss Marple turned the possibilities over in her mind. A painting emotionally raw, potentially scandalous. A girl vanished decades ago. And now a note hidden near the U referencing a painting and warning of disappearance. Could this old affair have a bearing on Daphne's return? Or Mrs. Bright's alleged motive? Or even the deeper tensions in Hawthorne Hall that led to the murder? She made a stop on the way home the village library. Mrs. Ellerton, the librarian, was surprised to see her. Anything particular I can help you find, Miss Marple? I wonder if you still keep the old registers. From the mid-1940s, perhaps? You mean the family archives? Yes, we've kept most of the society records in the back room. 10 minutes later, Miss Marple was seated at the long table near the window, carefully thumbing through a bound volume of parish newsletters and social notices. Births, marriages, club announcements, and then she found it. 1946. The Elderwood Ladies' Art Society held its spring exhibition in the parish hall, displaying an impressive variety of local work. Notable among the entries was a portrait submitted anonymously, believed to depict a Miss Evelyn Gray, who was last seen in Elderwood earlier this month. Miss Marple read the entry twice. Evelyn Gray, a name. Finally, she made a note. Further. Down the page, a smaller line caught her attention. Miss Evelyn Gray, age 23, has been reported missing. Last seen near Hawthorne Hall Gardens. Police have opened an inquiry, and nothing else. No follow-up, no resolution. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her armchair as dusk draped itself gently over the hedgerows and chimneys of Elderwood. She had lit the lamp and set her teacup on its saucer, but her eyes were far away. The implications unfolded carefully in her thoughts. Lady Hawthorne, long feared and respected, had harbored a secret. A scandal, buried under aristocratic propriety. The painting had perhaps not been destroyed, but hidden. Could Mrs. Bright have found it? Could Daphne? And was that what she knew about in the note? Had that been the secret someone feared coming to light? She turned the question over and over. There were still too many variables, and yet a knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Daphne Longhurst stood there, pale and wary, her coat drawn tightly around her. Miss Marple, she said softly, I need your help. The confession Daphne Longhurst stood hesitantly on the threshold of Fernley Cottage, her eyes flickering nervously as she held her hands tightly clasped beneath her coat. The late afternoon sun cast a wan, diffused glow over the village rooftops, but the chill in the air seemed to reach deeper than the season's change. Miss Marple met her with gentle composure, stepping aside to welcome her inside. Come in. Dear, she said softly, there's nothing to fear here. Daphne's shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and residual tension as she crossed the threshold. The faint scent of lavender and wood smoke enveloped her, a comfort against the storm that had settled within. They settled into the sitting room, where the firelight flickered faintly, lending warmth to the fading day. Miss Marple brewed tea with practiced ease, the clink of porcelain and the murmur of the kettle filling the brief silence before Daphne spoke. After a moment, Daphne's voice broke the quiet, trembling but firm. I've been running away, Miss Marple, running from the past, from myself, from the secrets that have haunted Elderwood for years. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, her eyes kind but unyielding. You're not the only one, she said gently. Sometimes the past demands a reckoning whether we like it or not. Daphne drew a shaky breath. After my mother's death, I was expected to take my place as the Lady of Hawthorne Hall, but it was never truly mine to inherit. My father, he never acknowledged me as his daughter. The estate was tangled with debts, disputes, and shadows, so many shadows. I've spent my life trying to understand what I was stepping into. Miss Marple listened intently, noting the flicker of pain behind Daphne's carefully guarded expression. And the painting? Miss Marple inquired softly. Daphne's eyes darted briefly toward the window. It's real. I've seen it. the one Miss Finch mentioned. It was hidden away by my mother, locked in a room that no one was allowed to enter. It depicts a woman who threatened everything Lady Hawthorne stood for, the woman my father loved before my mother. Evelyn Grey? Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. Evelyn Grey, she repeated thoughtfully. Yes. Daphne said she was more than just a mistress. She was my father's secret, the proof that his loyalty to my mother was always conditional. When Evelyn disappeared, the estate's foundations began to crumble, though no one spoke of it openly. Do you know what happened to her? Miss Marple pressed. Daphne shook her head. Only that she vanished without a trace. Some say she left to protect herself. Others believe she was forced out, or worse. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And the note found near the yew tree? The warning about the painting? Daphne looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I wrote it. I found the note in my mother's handwriting in the blue salon. I hid it, fearing that someone else might discover the truth and use it against me. I didn't want anyone to know that I was searching for answers. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the delicate threads of confession, weighing them against what she had already learned. Who else knows of your search? Daphne hesitated, then admitted, Miss Finch, she's the only other person I trust. And Mrs. Bright? Daphne's face paled. I never suspected her involvement until recently. I thought she was merely a quiet librarian, but the truth is more complicated. She was entangled in the past in ways I am only beginning to understand. Miss Marple sighed softly. It seems the shadows of Elderwood run deeper than any of us imagined. Daphne looked up, eyes glistening. I don't know who to trust anymore. I came to you because I believe you see things others miss. Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes the quietest voices reveal the loudest truths. As the evening deepened, Daphne's revelations opened a new window into Elderwood's tangled history, yet the puzzle remained incomplete. Miss Marple sensed that Daphne, though sincere, was still holding pieces back, whether out of fear, guilt, or something more complex. There was also the question of motive. If Mrs. Bright's actions had been driven by years of hidden pain and the looming threat of exposure, but what, Miss Marple wondered, had driven Daphne to conceal so much herself? And what of Miss Finch? What role had she truly played beyond that? Of a quiet confidant? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She would need to observe carefully in the days to come. Before Daphne left that evening, Miss Marple took her hand firmly. Remember, dear, sometimes the most powerful weapon is not silence, but truth spoken at the right moment. Daphne nodded, a fragile hope kindling in her eyes. As the door closed softly behind her, Miss Marple sank back into her chair. The flickering firelight cast long, shifting shadows across the room. The air was thick with unspoken questions and the weight of long-buried secrets. The game was nearly at its end, but the final move, like a carefully placed stitch in her embroidery, would require patience, subtlety, and a keen eye for detail. The morning after Daphne Longhurst's confession, Elderwood awoke to a brittle chill that hinted at the first touch of autumn. Trees along the village lanes were already dusted with gold, and the air carried the faint, earthy musk of fallen leaves. It was the sort of day that invited quiet reflection, or, as Miss Marple preferred, careful observation. Seated at the window of Fernley Cottage, Miss Marple contemplated the clues she had gathered, the faded note beneath the yew tree, the mysterious painting, Daphne's hesitant revelations, and Mrs. Bright's tangled history with Lady Hawthorne. The final piece of the puzzle remained hidden, concealed in plain sight, like the soft murmurings of village gossip. She decided to set a subtle test. No direct accusations, no dramatic confrontations, only the gentle art of watching, listening, and nudging the truth to the surface. She invited 3 women to tea: Daphne Longhurst, Miss Clara Finch, and somewhat reluctantly, Mrs. Helen Bright. The afternoon sun filtered softly through lace curtains as her guests arrived one by one. Daphne entered first, her posture still, tentative, eyes wary but determined. Miss Finch followed with her usual briskness, sharp gaze quietly assessing the room. Last came Mrs. Bright, composed and pale, her hands neatly folded in her lap. Miss Marple greeted them warmly and offered tea with freshly baked scones. "I thought it might be nice to have a quiet chat," she said gently, settling into her favorite armchair. Sometimes when things have been unsettled, the simple act of gathering helps to clarify what has been muddled. Her words were both an invitation and a gentle prod. The three women exchanged cautious glances, their expressions polite, but the tension between them unmistakable. The conversation began with safe topics: the weather, preparations for the village fete, the early turning of the leaves. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple's practiced ears and eyes detected something deeper. She turned the conversation gently. "I've been thinking about the portrait Miss Finch mentioned. The one locked away in the blue salon. It seems to carry more meaning than most realize." Miss Finch stiffened slightly but said nothing. Daphne's lips drew into a thin line. Surprisingly, it was Mrs. Bright who broke the silence. "Art often reveals truths people prefer to keep hidden," she murmured, gaze fixed on her teacup. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and sometimes those truths can be dangerous." She allowed a moment to pass before continuing. "Daphne, you mentioned you'd seen the painting. How did that come about?" Daphne swallowed and met Miss Marple's gaze. "My mother kept it hidden," she said quietly. "I found it one evening, concealed behind a loose panel in the blue salon. The image was raw, more than a portrait. It was a confession." Miss Finch interjected sharply. "That's enough, Daphne." Miss Marple raised a calming hand. "Please, Clara, everyone deserves to be heard." Miss Finch hesitated, then said, "Some wounds are best left unexposed." Mrs. Bright's fingers tightened around her cup. "Wounds, yes. But some secrets, once unearthed, demand justice." Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in posture, the fleeting glances exchanged. To press further, she produced the scrap of paper she had found beneath the yew tree. "I came across this recently," she said softly, unfolding the worn note. "It seems to have been written in haste, a warning, perhaps. She knows about the painting. If I disappear, look under. The rest is missing." Daphne inhaled sharply. Miss Finch's gaze darkened. Mrs. Bright looked away. Miss Marple continued gently, "Does this note mean anything to any of you?" Daphne spoke first. "I wrote it to protect myself, to warn anyone who might stumble on the truth that there was more at stake than they knew." Miss Finch's voice was tight. "Warnings are often ignored until it's too late." Mrs. Bright added quietly, "I understand now that I was part of a painful chapter, perhaps even a silent guardian." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Silent guardian?" Mrs. Bright nodded slowly. "I was afraid. Afraid the truth would destroy. More than reputations. That it would break the fragile peace we'd held on to." Miss Marple let the silence hang a moment. "But peace built on silence is brittle," she said. "It cracks under pressure." She turned to Miss Finch. "Clara, you served Lady Hawthorne closely. You must have seen the burdens she carried." Miss Finch's eyes softened. "She was shaped by fear and pride. She held many secrets, some just, others deeply cruel. I thought protecting her meant protecting the family, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes truth is the only protection that truly matters." A thoughtful silence fell over the room. Outside, the wind stirred fallen leaves against the window. At last, Miss Marple smiled gently. "Thank you. You've all shared much today, and I know it wasn't easy. But healing begins in the telling." The women nodded. Some tears glistened, some eyes held firm resolve. As her guests departed, Miss Marple stood at the window, gazing out over Elderwood. "The shadows may linger," she whispered, "but light always finds a way in." The drawing room of Hawthorne Hall, was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, filtered through tall mullioned windows and rich velvet curtains. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and a trace of lavender Miss Marple's touch. Seated comfortably in her chair, knitting forgotten in her lap, Miss Marple regarded the three women before her: Daphne Longhurst, Miss Clara Finch, and Mrs. Helen Bright. Each bore a different shade of apprehension. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began softly. "I know these past weeks have stirred difficult memories. But I've always believed the truth once brought gently to light can begin to heal. Her eyes scanned the room. This village, this house has harbored its share of secrets. A vanished woman, a hidden painting, and a tragedy left unspoken. She leaned forward, voice calm but resolute. It began with Evelyn Gray, the woman who disappeared, and the man who loved her, Daphne's father. Evelyn's presence threatened the careful facade Lady Hawthorne had built. The painting left behind was more than her likeness. It was a testament to betrayal. Daphne clenched her hands. Miss Marple continued. The painting was never destroyed. It was hidden behind a panel in the blue salon. Mrs. Bright discovered it years later while cataloging the estate. Mrs. Bright nodded slightly. I realized its significance and the damage it could cause, so I kept it hidden. Miss Marple's tone softened. But silence breeds more silence. In hiding it, you prolong the pain. She turned to Miss Finch. You knew more than most. About Evelyn, about Lady Hawthorne. Miss Finch nodded gravely. Evelyn was cast out, not spoken of, but everyone understood. Lady Hawthorne wouldn't allow a scandal. Daphne's voice trembled. But what of the murder? Miss Marple held her gaze. It was born of fear. Fear that the truth would finally emerge and destroy everything carefully preserved. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then, gently but firmly, she began to assemble the final pieces of the truth. Bright? Your growing anxiety over the painting being discovered and over Daphne's return led to a confrontation with Mrs. Bright's cousin, the man who had been trying to uncover the estate's secrets. The three women exchanged surprised glances. Mr. James Cartwright, the vicar's cousin, was the one who was found dead, Miss Marple said softly. He had been pressing for answers, convinced that the past held clues to Elderwood's troubles. Mrs. Bright's face paled. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I only wanted to protect what was left, Miss Marple nodded. I understand, but silence is a dangerous protector. Turning to Daphne, she said, Your return stirred the currents beneath the village's calm surface. It forced old wounds to open and new truths to emerge. Daphne's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Miss Marple rose, folding her hands calmly. The painting, the note, the hidden resentments, they all fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Each of you played a role, some knowingly, some unknowingly. But it is the weight of secrets kept too long that led to tragedy. She looked at each woman with gentle authority. Now Elderwood can begin to heal, but only if its shadows are acknowledged and the past laid to rest. A silence settled over the room, heavy but not oppressive. Then slowly Daphne stepped forward. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing beyond what others wanted to hide. Miss Marple smiled softly. It is always the quiet observations and the subtle truths that lead us home. The village slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The whispers of shadows had faded with the daylight, leaving Elderwood to move forward, changed but wiser. Miss Marple, ever the observer, sat in her garden, watching the sun dip low behind the trees. She reflected on the delicate balance of human nature, the courage, the fear, and the quiet strength it took to face one's truths. And with a satisfied sigh, she picked up her knitting once more, content in the knowledge that even the deepest shadows could not forever conceal the light.